The first thing you should know about salt is that people have killed for it, fought wars over it, built empires on it. For most of human history, salt was worth more than gold, because gold can't keep meat from rotting, and gold can't preserve a harvest through a winter that wants to starve you. People forget this now, with their grocery stores and their refrigerators. But in 1939, in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, where the nearest icebox was 20 miles away, and the nearest store might as well have been on the moon, salt was still life itself. The second thing you should know is that when the lawyer in Hazard, Kentucky, read aloud that my great-aunt Josephine Farrell had left me, Wren Farrell, age 15, ward of the Commonwealth, currently residing at the Harlan County Home for Girls, the property known as Farrell's Lick, comprising 9 acres of forested hillside and 1 salt cave of historical but no commercial value. Every person in that room thought the same thing. The girl got nothing. Farrell's Lick was a joke. Everybody in Perry County knew the story. There had been a salt lick on that hillside once, a natural brine spring where deer and elk had come for centuries, where the Shawnee and Cherokee had harvested salt long before any white man crossed the Cumberland Gap. Josephine Farrell's grandfather had bought the land in 1870, hoping to make his fortune in salt production. He had dug out the spring, followed the brine seep into the hillside, and discovered a small cave whose walls were crusted with salt deposits, halite, the purest form of rock salt, layered into the limestone like white frost on a window pane. He had mined it for a decade, selling salt by the barrel to towns across the Kentucky mountains. Then the railroads came. Then factory salt from Michigan and Ohio flooded the market at prices no small mountain operation could match. By 1890, Farrell's salt cave was abandoned. By 1900, it was forgotten. By the time Josephine Farrell died in the spring of 1939, the cave hadn't been worked in 50 years. The brine spring had silted over, and the whole property was considered as worthless as the girl who'd just inherited it. That girl was me. I was 15 years old. My mother had died when I was 6. Typhoid, the summer it swept through the mining camps along the Poor Fork. My father was a miner who survived the mines, but not the whiskey that followed. He drank himself gone by the time I was 8, and the state put me in the Harlan County Home, where I spent 7 years learning to cook, to clean, to mend, and to keep my mouth shut, none of which I was particularly good at, except the cooking. I could cook. That was the one thing every matron at the home agreed on. Wren Farrell was difficult, too curious, read too many books, asked too many questions. But Lord, that girl could cook. I could take nothing and make something from it. Bone broth from scraps. Soup from what other girls threw away. I knew how to stretch a meal and how to season it so that stretching didn't taste like poverty. The head cook, Mrs. Ballard, said I had a tongue that could taste what was missing in a dish, the way a musician could hear a wrong note in a song. If you want to find out what I did with 9 acres and a cave full of salt, and why the people who mocked my inheritance came begging at my door when the worst winter in half a century buried those mountains under 6 feet of snow, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what I built inside that cave didn't just save food, it saved an entire valley from starving. The home discharged me on a Wednesday in April. They gave me a paper bag with my clothes, $3 from the general fund, and a ride to Hazard in the back of the supply truck. From Hazard, I walked. 14 miles up the North Fork of the Kentucky River, then off the road onto a track that climbed through poplar and hemlock into a hollow so narrow the sky was a ribbon of blue between the ridges. Farrell's Lick was at the head of the hollow, where the creek began as a seep from the hillside and the forest closed in like a fist. The cabin was small. 2 rooms, log construction, a stone chimney that leaned but held. The porch was rotten in places. The roof was sound. Inside, the air smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke, and something else. Something clean and sharp and mineral that I couldn't identify until I realized it was salt. The whole cabin smelled faintly of salt, as if the earth itself were seasoning the air. My great-aunt Josephine had lived here alone for 40 years. I never met her. She and my mother had been estranged, for reasons nobody alive could explain. But her cabin told me who she was. She was neat. She was organized. She was a woman who labeled things and put them in rows, and believed that order was a form of love. The pantry shelves were lined with jars, empty now but labeled in her careful handwriting: venison, dry cure, pork belly, brine, trout, smoked, bear, peppered, rabbit, potted, dozens of labels, dozens of methods, all of them involving salt. On the kitchen table, as if she'd left it for me to find, was a leather-bound notebook. The cover was stained with grease and brine, and on the first page, in handwriting that was firm despite what must have been aged hands, it read, "The Salt Book, Recipes for Preservation. Josephine Farrell, 1899 to 1939. 40 years of recipes, 40 years of a woman alone in a hollow, perfecting the art of keeping food alive through salt and smoke and time." I opened it and read the first entry. Salt is patience made visible. It does not cook. It does not grow. It preserves. It holds the line between life and rot, and it asks nothing in return except that you use it with knowledge and respect. I held that notebook against my chest and I thought, I know you. I never met you, but I know you. You're the woman I was going to become. I found the cave on the second day. The entrance was behind the cabin, up a short scramble of mossy limestone, hidden behind a thicket of mountain laurel that had grown across the opening like a curtain. I pushed through and found myself standing in a passage about 6 feet wide and 7 feet tall, running straight into the hillside. The walls were damp and cool, and even in the dim light filtering from the entrance, I could see it. A white crust on the stone, thin in places, thick in others, glittering faintly like frost. Salt. Crystallized on the walls of the cave by centuries of brine seeping through the limestone and evaporating in the cool, dry air. I reached out and touched it. I put my finger to my tongue. It was clean and sharp and pure. Not bitter like some mineral salts, not muddy like the cheap block salt they sold at the general store. This was fine. White, crystalline salt with a flavor that was almost sweet underneath the brine. The cave went back about 80 feet, widening into a chamber roughly 30 feet across and 12 feet high. The salt deposits were thickest here, built up in layers on the walls and ceiling like mineral curtains. The floor was hard-packed clay, dry despite the dampness of the walls. The salt drew the moisture from the air, Josephine's notebook later explained, creating a natural dehumidifying effect that made the cave interior drier than any building on the surface. And the temperature. I noticed it immediately. The cave was cold, not freezing, but a steady, penetrating cool that I later measured at around 40 degrees year-round, cooler than a root cellar, cooler than a spring house. Combined with the dry, salt-saturated air, it created conditions that were, I would come to understand, nearly perfect for one specific purpose: curing meat. Josephine had known this. At the back of the chamber, she had built a curing room Wooden racks lined the walls, heavy oak frames with iron hooks, the kind you hang hams from. A long stone table, smooth and clean, stood in the center, scarred with decades of knife marks. Above it, wooden shelves held ceramic crocks with fitted lids, and in one corner, a smokehouse chimney, a stone channel built into the cave wall that connected to a fire pit just outside the cave entrance, allowing smoke to be piped into the chamber without heat. Cold smoking. The oldest preservation technique in the world, perfected by my great-aunt in a salt cave in eastern Kentucky. The racks were empty, the crocks were clean. Josephine had used up or given away everything she'd cured before she died, leaving the cave clean and ready, as if she knew someone was coming. The first months were learning and hunger, in equal measure. I had $3, a cabin, a cave, and Josephine's notebook. The notebook was extraordinary. Not just recipes, but a complete education in the science and craft of meat preservation. She described 5 methods in detail: dry curing with salt and spices rubbed directly into meat, brine curing in salt water of specific concentrations she'd calibrated over decades, cold smoking using the cave's chimney system, potting in rendered fat, and a method she called cave aging, hanging salted meat in the cave's constant cool, dry, salt air environment for weeks or months until it transformed into something dense and complex and intensely flavored. But knowledge without food is just words on a page, and I was hungry. The forest fed me that first spring, the way it had fed every desperate person in those mountains since the beginning. Ramps, greens, fiddleheads, morel mushrooms that grew in the poplar groves like gifts left on the forest floor. I fished the creek for brook trout, small but sweet, and snared rabbits with wire loops I fashioned from fence scraps behind the cabin. I planted a garden in the small clearing beside the cabin, using seeds I bought with my last dollar at the store in the nearest settlement, a place called Dwarf. Yes, that was its real name. 5 miles down the hollow. The man at the store, Mr. Combs, looked at me the way people in these stories always look at the girl, with pity and the particular cruelty of low expectations. "You the feral girl? Living up at the lick?" "I am. Josephine's place, the salt cave." He shook his head. "Ain't no living in salt, girl. Can't eat it, can't sell it, can't plant in it." "You can keep things alive with it," I said. He gave me my change without another word. My first cure was a rabbit. I caught it in late April, cleaned it according to Josephine's instructions. She was precise about cleaning, writing that preservation begins with cleanliness, not with salt, and rubbed it with a mixture I made from the cave salt, cracked black pepper from a jar in Josephine's pantry, and dried sage that still grew wild behind the cabin. I hung it in the cave on one of the iron hooks and waited. 3 weeks later, I took it down. The rabbit had transformed. The flesh was firm, dark, concentrated, all the wateriness of fresh meat pressed out by the salt, leaving behind something that tasted like the animal's whole life distilled into every bite. It was rich and clean and deeply savory, with the pepper and sage humming underneath, and a faint mineral sweetness from the cave salt that I had never tasted in any cured meat from a store. I ate that rabbit over 4 days, slicing it thin, and each slice was a revelation. Not just food, craft, art. The same impulse that makes a painter mix pigments or a musician tune an instrument. The desire to take a raw thing and, through knowledge and patience, make it more than it was. I was hooked, in every sense of the word. The first person who tasted my work was old Dorcas Webb. Dorcas was 76, a widow who lived alone in a cabin 2 miles down the hollow. She was the kind of mountain woman who could kill a copperhead with a hoe, deliver a calf, set a broken bone, and quote scripture from memory, all before breakfast. She had known Josephine. She had loved Josephine in the fierce, unsentimental way that mountain women love each other, through action, not words. She appeared at my cabin in May with a sack of cornmeal and a look that said she was evaluating me the way you evaluate a tool. Will it work, or is it junk? Josephine said you'd come, Dorcas told me. Wrote me a letter before she passed. Said she had a grandniece in the state home who could cook. Said the girl would find the cave and know what to do with it. She never met me, I said. Didn't need to. She knew the blood. Ferals have always had salt in their hands. I gave Dorcas a piece of the cured rabbit. She ate it slowly, chewing with the deliberation of someone who takes food seriously. When she finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she looked at me with eyes that had seen 76 years of mountain hardship, and she said, "That's Josephine's cure. That's her salt, her method, her hands. How'd you learn it?" Her notebook. She left the notebook. Dorcas nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. She left the notebook for you. All right then. What do you need? Meat, I said. I can cure anything. I just need something to cure. Dorcas smiled, the first time I saw her smile. I've got a hog I've been meaning to slaughter. Let's see what that cave can do. What the cave could do was miraculous. Dorcas brought the hog, a fat Berkshire she'd been feeding acorns all autumn the year before. We slaughtered it together, Dorcas guiding me through the process with the patient brutality of someone who understands that meat comes from death, and there's no point pretending otherwise. We broke the carcass down on the stone table in the cave, and I went to work. I followed Josephine's recipes exactly. The hams got the full treatment. A dry rub of cave salt, brown sugar, black pepper, and saltpeter. Josephine had a small supply, and I found more at the store in Dwarf, pressed into the flesh and packed around the bone. They went onto the hooks in the coldest part of the cave, where the temperature held steady at 38 degrees, and they stayed there. Josephine's notebook said 6 months minimum for a proper country ham. I gave them 8. The shoulders got a brine cure, submerged in crocks filled with salt water so concentrated that a fresh egg would float in it, flavored with juniper berries and bay leaves and a touch of molasses. 4 weeks in the brine, then hung to dry in the cave air for another 4. The belly became bacon, dry cured for 10 days, then cold smoked through the cave's chimney system using hickory and applewood. The smoke entered the cave cool and fragrant, wrapping around the hanging bellies for 3 days straight, while I kept the fire pit outside fed with a slow, steady supply of dampened chips. The scraps became sausage, ground with sage and red pepper flakes, and stuffed into casings Dorcas had saved and cleaned. The bones became stock. The fat was rendered into lard, so white and clean it looked like snow. Nothing was wasted. Josephine's notebook had a section titled "No Part Unused" that read like a commandment. When I pulled the first smoked bacon from the hooks and sliced it and fried it over the cabin stove, the smell that filled the hollow was so good that Dorcas, who was sitting on the porch, started laughing. "Lord God, girl," she said. "Josephine is dancing in her grave." Word spread the way it always does in the mountains, slowly, on foot, through the mouths of people who have tasted something they can't stop thinking about. Dorcas told her neighbors. Her neighbors told theirs. By late summer, people were making the trek up to Farrell's Lick to buy cured meat from the girl in the salt cave, and every one of them left shaking their heads because they had never tasted anything like it. The cave salt was the secret. Not the only secret. Josephine's methods were meticulous, her timing precise, her combinations of spices calibrated over decades. But the salt was the foundation. It was purer than store-bought salt, with a mineral complexity that flavored the meat as it preserved it. A ham cured with Farrell's cave salt didn't just taste like ham. It tasted like the mountain itself, clean and ancient and patient. By autumn of 1939, I had a business. Not a big one. I was still one girl with one cave and one pair of hands. But I was curing meat for families throughout the hollow and the next hollow over. People brought me their hogs, their venison, their bear meat in season, their wild turkeys and rabbits, and even the occasional goose. I charged what I could, sometimes money, sometimes trade, sometimes nothing at all for families who couldn't afford either. Then came the winter of 1940. It announced itself in November with a cold snap that froze the creek solid overnight. December brought snow. Not the light mountain snow that melts by noon, but a heavy, relentless, suffocating snow that fell for 3 days without stopping and buried the hollow under 4 feet of white silence. Then it snowed again, and again. By January, the drifts were 6 feet deep in places. The road to Dwarf was impassable. The road to Hazard might as well have been a memory. The hollow was sealed shut, and the people inside it were alone with whatever they had stored. Most hadn't stored enough. That was the brutal truth of mountain poverty in 1940. People lived harvest to harvest, paycheck to paycheck for those who had paychecks, and a winter that arrived early and stayed late was a death sentence for anyone who hadn't put enough away. Gardens had been poor that year. A late frost in May had killed the early plantings, and a dry August had stunted everything else. Root cellars were thin, pantries were bare. By February, families in the hollow were down to cornmeal and prayer, and in my cave, behind the cabin on the hillside, hanging from iron hooks in the cold, salt-saturated dark, were 200 pounds of cured meat, hams, shoulders, bacon, sausage, dried venison strips rubbed with salt and cracked pepper, smoked trout packed in crocks, potted rabbit sealed under a layer of rendered lard. Josephine's methods didn't just preserve food, they preserved it for months, even years. The cave's constant temperature and salt air environment stopped time. Meat that would have rotted in a week on the surface could last a year underground, getting better with age the way good cheese does, the flavors deepening and concentrating. I didn't wait for people to come to me. The snow was too deep for some of the older folks to travel, and pride would have kept the rest at home until their children were crying from hunger. I packed meat into a canvas sack, strapped on the snowshoes Dorcas had given me. She'd made them herself, ash frames with rawhide lacing. And I walked. I walked to every cabin in the hollow. 8 families. 14 miles of snowshoe track through drifts that came to my chest in places. I left smoked bacon and cured venison and sausage on doorsteps when people wouldn't open the door because they were too ashamed to be seen needing help. I knocked and waited and handed food to women whose eyes were hollow with worry, and I told each of them the same thing. This is from the cave. There's more. Send someone when you need it. Mr. Combs, the store owner who had told me you can't eat salt, was among the families I visited. His store was closed, his shelves empty, his wife sick with a chest cold that wouldn't break. I gave him a cured ham and a crock of potted rabbit, and he held the ham in both hands and looked at it, and then looked at me, and his mouth worked, but nothing came out. "It's all right," I said. "Salt keeps things alive. That's what it does." Dorcas, who had accompanied me on the first round of deliveries before her knees gave out, watched me pack for the second round and said what the old ones always say in these stories. They laughed at you and your cave and your salt. Why are you feeding them? Because Josephine would have, I said, and because I knew what hungry felt like, the specific hollow ache of it, the way it steals your thoughts and replaces them with a single word repeated endlessly. Food, food, food. I knew it from 7 years in the home, where meals were small and hope was smaller, and I had sworn to myself on the day I first tasted my own cured rabbit in the mouth of that cave that I would never let anyone feel that hunger, if I had the power to stop it. The winter broke in late March. By then, my cave had fed every family in the hollow for 6 weeks. Not generously. There wasn't enough for generous. But enough. Enough to keep children alive and old people warm, and the thin thread of survival unbroken through the worst winter anyone in Perry County could remember. Spring came like a resurrection. The snow melted, and the creek roared, and the hollow shook itself awake. And the first thing people did, before planting, before repairing, before anything else, was come to my cabin. Not to thank me, though some did, to ask me to teach them. They wanted to learn how to cure, how to smoke, how to brine and pot and preserve, how to turn a fall slaughter into a winter's worth of food that didn't depend on roads or stores or anything outside their own hands. The winter had taught them what Josephine had known for 40 years, that preservation was not a convenience, but a survival skill, and that the girl with the salt cave was not a joke, but the most important person in the hollow. I taught everyone who asked. I held classes in the cave, 5, 6 people at a time, standing around the stone table while I demonstrated Josephine's methods. I shared her recipes. I gave away cave salt in cloth bags to families who wanted to try curing at home. I held back nothing. Dr. Howard Creech, the county agricultural agent, heard about my operation and drove up the hollow in the summer of 1940. He spent 2 days studying the cave, its temperature, its humidity, its salt deposits, its natural cold smoking chimney. And he wrote a report that called it one of the finest natural curing environments in the state of Kentucky. He connected me with the State Extension Service, which sent a team to document Josephine's methods and publish them in a pamphlet distributed to farming families across eastern Kentucky. The pamphlet was titled Salt Cave Preservation: Traditional Methods for Mountain Families. My name was on it, and Josephine's. It was the first time either of us had been in print. I married in 1944. His name was Hollis Clay, a returning soldier from the next county who had lost 2 fingers on his right hand in North Africa and found that the only work he could do well with 8 fingers was the careful, patient work of butchering and curing. He came to the cave to learn and stayed because he understood, the way only someone who has been close to death understands, that preserving food is an act of faith. You salt a ham in October, believing you will be alive in March to eat it. That belief is not trivial. It is everything. We had 3 children in that hollow. We expanded the curing operation until the cave held not just our own meat, but meat from families across 3 hollows, brought to us in autumn and returned to them cured and smoked and ready for winter. We trained apprentices, young people from the mountains, who learned Josephine's methods and carried them home. Dorcas died in 1948, at 85, on a spring morning with the red buds blooming pink outside her window. I buried her on the hillside above the cave, and Hollis carved her stone from limestone, Dorcas Webb. She brought the first hog. That was enough. By the 1950s, the Farrell's Lick Curing House, as Dr. Creech had officially named it, was producing country hams that people drove from Lexington and Louisville to buy. Not because they were desperate, but because they were extraordinary. The cave salt, the cold smoking, the 8-month aging in salt-saturated air. These produced a ham that food writers called the finest in Kentucky, with a depth of flavor that factory-cured hams couldn't touch. I wrote a book in 1965, The Salt Book, Josephine Farrell's Methods for Preserving the Harvest, published by the State University Press. I kept Josephine's name first because it was her work. I was only the hands that carried it forward. Hollis passed in 1973, in the cabin, in October, with the smell of hickory smoke drifting up from the cave. I buried him beside Dorcas on the hillside. I kept working. My hands knew the cure the way my tongue knew flavor. Instinctively, precisely, without hesitation. I could judge salt concentration by feel. I could tell by pressing a ham with my thumb whether it needed another week or another month. The cave and I had become one system, one organism, breathing the same salt air and keeping the same slow time. I died in the spring of 1981, at 57. The mountains take years the way they give beauty, without asking permission. They found me in the cave, sitting at the stone table with Josephine's notebook open and a fresh ham on the hooks above me, salted and peppered, and beginning the long, patient transformation from raw to cured. My daughter said I looked content. My son said I looked like someone who had finished seasoning something and was waiting for it to be ready. The cave is still curing. My granddaughter runs the operation now. Expanded, celebrated, written about in food magazines, and visited by chefs from as far as New York and San Francisco. The country hams from Farrell's Lick are considered among the finest in America. Josephine's methods, preserved in her notebook and passed through my hands to my children's hands to theirs, have not changed. The cave salt is still harvested from the same walls. The hickory smoke still enters through the same stone chimney. The iron hooks still hold their weight in the same cold, patient dark. On the wall of the cave, near the entrance, my children mounted a plaque. It reads, Josephine Farrell kept the salt. Wren Farrell Clay kept the faith. The cave keeps everything. So let me ask you this. What have you been told is worthless? What inheritance of skill, of knowledge, of something old and patient and unfashionable have you dismissed because someone told you it had no commercial value? What cave full of salt are you sitting next to, waiting for someone to tell you it's worth something, when the answer has been there all along? Because here's what salt taught me. Preservation is not glamorous. It's not fast. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks or headlines. It works in the dark, in the cold, in silence, over weeks and months and years. It takes what's raw and vulnerable and turns it into something that endures. And it asks nothing except patience and respect. That's not just salt. That's how you build a life. The people who mocked my inheritance were looking for something loud and immediate, gold, oil, something they could sell by Tuesday. They didn't understand that the most valuable things work slowly, that a cave full of salt is a cave full of time, that the girl who learns to preserve the harvest is the girl who survives the winter that kills everyone else's hope. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the slow, patient, unglamorous skills that actually keep the world alive, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who turned what nobody wanted into what everybody needed. Your salt cave is not empty. It's full of everything you need. You just have to learn to use it before the winter comes.